pero voy a parar. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to this session as part of the Liviana Conference 2021. So we're here to, well, you're in the session that's about diverse economies and urban studies, continuing the conversations. Hopefully you're all in the right place. A few more people have signed up to join us, so perhaps they'll join us as we go along, or perhaps they're taking a well-earned break, which is fine as well. We're recording the session so we can send it to the kind of emerging group of people that are interested in this topic. So that's nice. So I will just say a few words to kind of introduce myself and introduce the session. And then we can maybe, as we're a small group, have some more introductions and then get going, if that sounds okay. So yes, so I'm Mavanwi Taylor. I've just started I'm based in London in the UK. I just started a new position at University College London, doing a new project on local industrial strategies. And I've also worked in markets, traditional retail markets, and kind of workspace struggles and community planning and this kind of thing. I've been a member of CERN for a while, but I haven't had the chance to get much involved in activities. So this is really nice for me to have a chance to meet some of you. Yeah, and thanks. So this initiative, I guess today's session is kind of called Continuing the Conversation around Diverse Economies and Urban Studies, because last year some of you were on a kind of very informal call, which we managed to organize across time zones to start this conversation. Just it sort of emerged and happened through the email list for CERN, but this is the first more formally organized session. And thanks to Pete and Christian, who kind of came forward to help me organize this, as well as to Alison and Anna and Kerry and others from CERN, who've obviously done all the organizing work for this online conference. So it is, as I said, a follow-on from last year's session, and it continues with the informal approach because we're just at the beginning of thinking about these things together. What we proposed, Pete, Christian and I, was to have maybe a first hour of the 2-hour session that we have for short informal presentations, 5 minutes or so, from anyone who wishes to say something about something they're working on, or an idea that they have, or a set of issues that they want to bring to the discussion. Because we're a small group, we then will also allow maybe brief 5-minute responses from everybody about any key points emerging from you. And then as we go into the second hour, the plan would be to move to the more collective discussions about the emerging themes and topics, but also emerging ideas and things we might want to do together or separately to take the work forward and the thinking and the action forward. So that's more or less the plan. As I say, it is informal, so please use the chat as well as freely participating, you know, on the audio and the video. Please use the chat to share resources. I'm happy to collect together any resources shared in the course of the session and circulate these. So we'll save the chat as well as have the session recorded. Yeah, and if you're not already on the kind of emerging email list for the kind of Urban Studies meets Diverse Economies group, then I'm very happy to add you to that. Please drop me a message in the chat if you're not on that and you'd like to join it. So, Pete, did I miss anything? No, okay. So because we're, and Christian, hello, I see you now as well on the call. Because we're a small group, perhaps I hand over to the next person on my screen to introduce themselves. Alison, I don't know, are you taking part or are you more in the background, whichever you want?
I could be in the background, but I can introduce myself also. Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Alison Guzman. I am originally from the US, but I've been here working with Mapuche indigenous communities in southern Chile, which is where I'm based. I work with my partner, Ignacio Crel. we've been working on regenerative economies with the Lago Budi coastal communities since 2013. It's a rural area, but we moved here to a place in Villarrica called Villarrica here in the mountains a couple of years ago, and we've been exploring the possibility of figuring out how we can contribute back into the urban setting. So I'm curious to explore or hear from everyone in this room what proposals can emerge in a more urban setting. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. That's great. Feel free to participate or not, I know you've got lots to do. So yeah, we'll come back to everybody for kind of 5-minute presentations, but perhaps the next person on my screen is Anna, and then maybe you can pass on to whoever's next for you.
Gracias. Buenos días. Estoy en Buenos Aires, Argentina. I'm very happy to see you all. And I'm supporting the supporter, but I'm also interested in the topic. And I just realized that if I could, I may add something to the session in regards to the content, if you guys allow me to do that at some point. But I'll stay for the whole session because I was supposed to be supporting the organización, pero I'm interested in the content also. And I pass the word to Christian.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Christian Anderson. Thanks to my family and everybody for organizing. I'm excited to see everyone. I am based in Seattle in the United States, and I'm associate professor at the University of Washington, Bothell. I'll have a lot more to say about stuff I'm thinking about when there's space here, but excited to meet everyone. And I'll pass it on to Nate.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nate Gabriel. I'm a teaching professor at Rutgers with Kevin, and Priscilla's here too. Hi, Priscilla. And what do I want to say? I'm based in Philadelphia, although I commute up to New Jersey whenever it's time to teach or be there for a faculty meeting or something like that. My research is, well, I don't do a whole lot of research these days. I do a lot of teaching, but my interests are in kind of urban political ecology, the intersection between nature, society, and especially in urban contexts. As a longtime member of CERN and the CEC, which I don't even know if it still exists, but I've been interested in this, the tension between kind of urban theory as the abstract for this session, states the problem, the kind of tension between the ways that urban theory tends to frame the urban as a mostly capitalist driven kind of enterprise, and my desire to think otherwise. So anyway, yeah, I'm excited to see you all. A lot of you I haven't seen for a long time. So it's good to be here, and I'm interested to see where the conversation goes. I'm just going to pass it to Pete because he's the next one on my list here.
Hello, folks. Greetings from Liverpool, not in England. The People's Republic of Liverpool is geographically in England, but it's not of England. So yeah, I'm interested in cities. I did my PhD at the School for Advanced Urban Studies at Bristol University, and then I worked for the local economy policy unit at South Bank University in London, which was set up to support the local socialisms of the early 1970s and 80s. I worked on inner city policy in my 20s in the 1980s for the Action for Cities initiative. So yeah, I'm interested in cities and how they work, and interested in discussions about how we might think about diverse economies in urban ways. And I will pass on to Priscilla.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm new to CERN. It's my second seminar the year that I'm attending, and I'm also assistant professor at Rutgers, New Brunswick in geography and Latino and Caribbean studies. My work is at the intersection of diverse economies, community economies, urban studies, Black geographies, and Black feminism in Brazil, mostly, but now expanding to a broader Afro-Latinx geography. My dissertation work and my follow articles have been on the experience of Black women organizing community banking in favela City of God in Rio de Janeiro. And I'm currently working on a book manuscript around the concept of quilombismo or marronage, urban marronage, Black feminist urban marronage, as a praxis of autonomous economies in majority Black territories. And I'll pass it. Well, I got here late, but whoever's next, Chris.
I think maybe we've had Christian, so maybe I can see Marcus left on my screen. Marcus, we're just doing very brief introductions before we get going.
Yes, this is me, Marcus, and left to me is my research associate, Emil. So let's see how the conversation will go. I apologize already in advance if I pass out for some time. I'm a PhD student since February 2020 in Leipzig, and we have this I have my PhD on companies in the South Caucasus and Central Asia. The official title of our project says something like innovative companies in unlikely places. So we started with the notion of unlikely places, but then we were thinking about a whole lot of things, how to else call it, peripheral places. And then we also came around this ordinary city approach by Robinson. I don't even know if it's really urban what I do, if it has a relation to that, but I'm curious because I found the Robinson's debate pretty interesting. Let's see where it will go. I wouldn't say I'm an urbanist, but I'm really interested in the conversation.
Great, that's so interesting to hear from you all already, and we have the chance to develop a bit some of our own ideas and formations of what this could be, as well as learn from each other and see what else is there in between. So thank you all so much for giving the time to come. And yeah, it's continuing the conversation, and hopefully it will continue afterwards. So for anybody who wasn't on earlier, this is going to be quite an informal session. Alison, I see in the chat saying Anna may be still yet to introduce herself, but she did earlier on. So I think we are good. Thank you, though. So the plan for those who didn't hear earlier on is we have the first hour, so until 0:00. For me, it will be 5 p.m. For you, it will be the next hour for wherever you are, to hear maybe short 5-minute informal presentations from anybody who wishes to make one about anything you prepared or anything you want to say. So what I was thinking was, of course, nobody has to do this. You can quite happily come in later on if you wish. I'm looking for one person to volunteer to go first, and then I would suggest that we go in the order of the screen. So, because I don't like it when everybody's waiting, oh, when will I be, that can be a bit stressful. And I would say I'll do you a very gentle prompt in the chat when you've had 4 minutes, so you can wind up. But of course, we continue the conversation in the second hour then, with some short, perhaps anybody wants to make any immediate short response, and then we get into the collective discussion. So that's the plan. So is there anybody who would want to start us off with a short presentation? Pete, thank you so much. So, so Pete would be first. Thank you, Pete. Christian, you're next on my screen. Would you like to give, you've got something prepared, I think. You would go next. And Nate, you are third. Yeah, is that
I'm not,
for you?
yeah, I'm not sure I
If you
have
would
a whole,
like.
I'm not sure I have much. I mean, I haven't prepared
Okay.
anything, but maybe I'll be inspired by Pete
Yeah.
and Christian.
Well, see what you think. If you want to take up after Christian, you can. Priscilla, you would then be next, if that's okay for you. Oh gosh, I know, I've realized I'm going to be last. This is going to be terrible, but there we go. Marcus, if you are ready and able, you can say, but also perhaps if the timing suits you to start earlier because of your research assistant, you just let us know and you can jump in any time that is convenient for you. So if you want to start now, if it's easy for you, you let us know. Anyway, you put in the chat if you're ready to go now or later. We can be flexible. Anna, then if you want to add something, and then that would be me last. So we have 7 people. So that should take us more or less to 5 o'clock for me and your o'clock, wherever you are. Okay, so Pete, yeah, if you wouldn't mind to get us going, and I give you like a short, just a little message in the chat when we're at 4 minutes, okay? Thanks.
Sure thing, yeah. It's not so much a presentation as just thinking, really. Chatted with my family earlier on. I was involved in the earlier discussion, and I've been looking at cities for all of my academic career, but I haven't always really thought about it. Are cities just the backdrop to what I do? Am I an urbanist? I specifically went to a school for advanced urban studies to do my PhD, so perhaps I am. And when I was in New Zealand, Aotearoa, I was talking to people not in cities, and they just kept saying lots of things to me that I thought were fascinating about what is special about cities that they didn't have in more rural areas. So when we're talking about diverse economies, is there something about cities that we're not really thinking through enough? What is a city as opposed to a rural area? Where does the city begin? Where does the city end? What's the edge of the city? How do spaces outside the city flow into the city, and how does the city support those kind of areas? Is there something about propinquity, lots of people together, the resources that cities provide with everybody coming up close together, the population levels, the diversity of cities, movement around cities, public transport around cities, ways that travel around cities, the way that rich and poor are up against each other, and what does that mean that you don't get in rural areas where there is less going on? Or is there something about in Britain, I don't know whether you have that where you guys are, sort of the myth of the rural idyll, the place where you can get away from the city is chaotic, the city is problematic. It's better to go and set up diverse economies practices in the UK in places like Totnes in the countryside, where you can get lots of like-minded people coming together to develop something. And in the city, there's just too much going on there. So what then that sort of suggests what kind of city are we talking about? Where is this city? What kind of state is this city in? What's the finance of that city? What resources has it got? What independence has it got? How much can it do of what it wants to do independently because it's left alone? Or is this a city in a place like the UK where there's very, very little ability to do anything differently? It's very, very centralised. Liverpool has had 60% of its funding cut over the past 10, 15 years. So what it can do is a lot more limited. We've got central government appointed commissioners running the city because government decided that the people that run the city are corrupt. Not saying anything about that, but that kind of independence. Or are we talking about cities, or are we talking about places within cities? So niches, different spaces, the suburbs, peri-urban areas. Are we talking about urban subcultures? So Marcus and I were talking a little bit a couple of weeks ago about my love of Day Air Punk, and he's from Leipzig. And he said, yes, there's plenty of spaces in cities that you can go to develop that kind of subculture. So are we talking about cities, or are we talking about spaces within cities? What about in Latin America? You've got Zibetche's ideas of unruly territories in cities. When I went to parts of Buenos Aires and saw the barter markets and the occupied factories. That then suggests, when we're talking about cities, how important is this capitalocentric view of cities? David Harvey's view of managerial cities, we can critique as capitalocentric, but how do we handle the fact that for those running cities, that's the bleeding obvious common sense that they don't really see? And can we develop alternatives, and what do they look like? Do we need to be thinking of diverse cities as one space, or do we need to be thinking about more diverse spaces within cities? Do we want to be developing an alternative to the entrepreneurial thesis, or do we want to just say it's there but put it in its place? Yes, cities will want to market themselves to capital entrepreneurially, get visitors in, and we say, well, that's fine. Or are we more with sort of rebel cities ideas, that we want to challenge something, develop something more conflictual, more angry about cities? Do we just put entrepreneurial cities in their space, or are we developing a more stronger view of diverse cities? And is that totalizing? We don't want to do that. I don't know. Lots of questions, and I didn't really get onto the non-human whole area where we can talk about the non-human in cities that other people I'm sure will mention. So I'll stop there, Mafanwi.
Thank you, Pete, so much. I think you got us off to a great start. Thank you very much indeed. Next on my list is Christian, if you're okay to start, and then we'll progress. And yes, Marcus, fine, absolutely, to just stay and listen and come in later on as and when you want. I see your message in the chat. Thank you.
All right, cool. Thanks for starting us off, Peter. There's a lot in there that we can riff on. I'm going to try to share my screen if I can. Is that okay? Okay, cool. And I'll put on my own stopwatch here so that I don't go over time, because I think when the screen shares, you can't really see the chat very well. But so, following a lot of what Peter said, I've been thinking about probably too many things in relation to cities, and I'm going to share an image and just sort of like riff from where I'm at in that sort of community economies tradition. But I'll just sort of preface that by saying I'm thinking a lot about forms of unwaged and voluntary labor in the city and how they influence value formations. I'm thinking a lot about infrastructure, and particularly social infrastructures, and kind of, I think of them as performative infrastructures or infrastructures related to culture and ideology. I'm thinking a lot about land and land use and different forms of land stewardship. I'm thinking a lot about sort of connections between social and ecological stuff, and then I'm thinking about a lot of different futures. But to sort of riff on Peter, I'm also thinking a lot about the internal diversity of cities and the propinquity and a lot of the stuff that's going on there, and how we would make sense of that in sort of community economies terms. So here's a screenshot. Can people see that? So this is the street outside my house in spring of 2020, at the height of the kind of uprisings around racial justice, injustice, policing. So I have a city council member for the city of Seattle who lives across the street from my house. And during city council debates about what should happen with policing, there were probably 5 very organized large crowd marches that went and held, sort of occupied the space outside his house and spray painted the street with all this stuff, including slogans and his phone number. And they were sort of making demands that he vote in particular ways, playing music and kind of having a festival atmosphere out in the boulevard. Then no sooner would they leave than neighbors would come out, clean up their graffiti, and sort of the neighborhood social media pages were blowing up with conversation about how to support the city council member, and sort of upset by the protesters who were marching in the neighborhood. So they formed kind of like neighborhood civic alliances to try and think about how the neighborhood could think about mitigating against these protesters. Meanwhile, down here in the park and up along the boulevard, there are homeless encampments where people who have been priced out of housing are setting up basically tent cities in public spaces to a large enough scale that there's some degree of sort of de facto cooperation necessary to run those spaces. And the neighbors are upset about that too. And on the neighborhood boards, they're thinking about how to clean up the streets and get rid of the informal settlements that are popping up in the park and in the boulevards. And citizen groups are even organizing like neighborhood sweeps and cleanups to go out and in unauthorized ways, sort of throw people's possessions away, try to get them off of land adjacent to their property. Meanwhile, then last summer, we had this heat dome event where the temperatures got historically high. There were deaths in the region, and there wasn't much talk in the cooperative chats or any of these spaces about how to deal with that through any of these mechanisms. But people have started to install their own solar panels and air conditioning and all these other kinds of things. So just sort of thinking from where I'm at, what I see here is a ton of cooperative labor of different kinds going in different directions that is ricocheting in the kind of value environment around property. It's ricocheting through urban policy conversations. It is alerting us to sort of formations of urban political economy, processes of displacement, things that are going on in the city. And I've been working with some groups to try and think about anti-displacement stuff in the face of what's going on. But I think my question echoes a lot of what Peter was saying. How would we make sense of a lot of this stuff in and through the language of community economies? And in particular, how would we think about, thinking about the labor that's going on here and the generativity of all of it in terms of community economy stuff, but when a lot of these people wouldn't view themselves as commoners or as people who are engaged in community economies type generative, value influencing behavior. So I think that's me just throwing a whole mess of stuff out there, but I'm really excited to talk to different people about how you're making sense of this stuff and how we can think about some of these different intersections in community economies terms.
Great, thank you so much, Christian, and precisely to time. It was amazing. That was really nice, sort of, I guess, way into such a lot of issues. And I do think we're at the beginning of thinking, well, I mean, I'm not aware of these debates happening elsewhere, so it's nice to be thinking through them together. I think I have Nate next, if you are ready. I think you were deciding whether or not you wanted to say anything now. Did you decide?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna, I guess, riff a little bit. I mean, like I said, well, I'll just say, I mean, I feel like this question that I think both Pete and Christian raised, I mean, this question has been on my mind, since grad school, about how this tension between the ways that, well, I guess on the one hand, the ways that the urban is typically theorized in academic literature and the ways that I wanted to sort of get beyond that. But, Pete raised a point that I find a really important point about how did he put it? Managers, city managers, but also the ways that just sort of everyday people in all different places perform the city and perform the urban as a kind of capitalocentric thing, which to me suggests that we can't just, I think I said I want to think otherwise, but we can't just think otherwise. We also have to account for the ways that the city is performed in all kinds of different ways, the ways that it's theorized. And for that matter, I mean, I think it's important to I don't know this. Yeah, see, I'm not doing a very good job of riffing. I think it's really important to think about a kind of like if you want to call it capitalist structuring, rather than sort of, you know, put out a kind of like assert an already existing capitalist structure. There are all kinds of ways that the world is structured, you know, sort of actively and performed that way. And I think it's really important for me to think through that. And I guess to connect that to the kinds of things that I've been thinking about. I didn't mention this earlier. I mean, most of my published work is on kind of urban nature management kinds of things, but recently I've been thinking a lot about the kind of digital world and the role that it plays in our lives. And I just did this exercise with my students in class yesterday where I, you know, had them explore the different kinds of data that platforms use and operate, use that data to kind of act on and mediate the relationship that my students have with the rest of the world. And to me, that's another really good example of the ways that our urban lives are structured by data platforms and so on, which isn't to say that we're kind of, and this actually, I guess the reason I have been thinking about all this is because I've been really depressed the last several months, you know, thinking about these kinds of things, thinking about the Black Lives Matter protests, thinking about all of the effects, all of the kinds of inequalities that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. Like really, I mean, in Gibson Graham's phrase, I've been really racked by left melancholia. You know, like I think I need to go back and reread Post-Capitalist Politics because, yeah, I find that when I think especially about the digital world, to me, my students weren't worried about it at all. But it's because I think they're in some ways fully emerged capitalist data subjects, you know what I mean? And so, you know, anyway, I know that I'm not really, yeah, I really am just kind of rambling a little bit, but this is what I'm trying to wrestle with, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And I'm trying to think about, I guess one other thing that I'll say, I don't see the chat because I'm on an iPad, but I've been thinking a lot about opting out, the possibility of opting out, and what that means, what it means to try to opt out, why it's so difficult to opt out. I mean, especially in the context of the digital world, but in other ways. And it just occurred to me as you all were talking that looking for ways to opt out is not really a good solution, I think, or maybe some combination of opting out and also, you know, resisting in all kinds of ways and resisting from, yeah, I don't know. I guess all I'm saying is that my thoughts aren't super well formed, as you can tell, but I guess I'll just end by saying the thing I'm trying to think about now is how to confront what seem like really well constructed, a really well constructed sphere in which we in some ways don't have a choice but to operate within, and what to do about that, how to find room to move, how to not just resist, you know, but to do something else and find other worlds and think in other ways. Anyway, that's all I have to say, but yeah, sorry that it wasn't a bit more cohesive, coherent.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts and feelings, Nate, and your general, you know, what your the kind of the sense that you have at the moment. It doesn't matter, it's not fully formed, it's still there. And I think, yeah, you know, those sensibilities, those feelings, those challenges, I think, I'm sure resonate with everybody. So hopefully we can bring them in and think with them and be one place at least to explore how to be and act and do and resist and do differently, whatever. Anyway, so let's move on, not because we're parking it, but because we'll come back to it. And next is Priscilla, if you are ready, and feel free to take the conversation whichever way you wish. Over to you.
All right. I guess I'll just say a little bit about things that questions I've been grappling with and I'm concerned about. I'm from Brazil, and I came I came to the work of Jason Graham in like 2010 when I was doing my master's program at UNC Chapel Hill. And previously to that, I had been organizing and teaching in popular education Freirian projects in Brazil. And it was like self-managed 500, working class, public school students in occupied buildings, completely independent and self-managed. The project's still ongoing to this day. It's been going on for over 15 years. But at the time, we used the language of like, we're activists, or, we're the working class. We didn't even use so much the language of solidarity economies, which emerged very strongly in the beginning of the 2000s with the Workers' Party. And then in 2010, that's when I come to the language of diverse economies and community economies. And I was like, well, I guess we had been doing solidarity economies. And in fact, we had been doing diverse economies and all of that. And it was really interesting language to me because of how I came from a trajectory of thinking about diversity from a race, sexuality and gender perspective. So I started working with that framework, and then later just kind of feeling like there was room for much more engagement with critical race theory, particularly like how is it that community economies engage racial analytics and the racialized urban analytics specifically. And so I would be working with the folks in Favela City of God, and they be talking about claiming their rights to the favela. So they're not talking about the right to the city, they're talking about the rights to their favela. This is a majority Black territory. But the language of community economies spoke to them much more even than solidarity economies. And one of the reasons is because the stigma around favela, the wording of favela, which is defined by the National Census as subnormal human settlement, is one that sometimes politically they have distanced themselves and they use the word community. Like I live in a favela, they say I live in community, city of God. So the word community economies spoke to them very easily to describe how is it that they were there, and how is it that they have been able to be there for 40 years despite intense army occupation, intense militia occupation, intense urban war basically against the Black bodies in that majority Black territory. So, just my issue with, like, I'm not an urbanist per se, and I think of like geography or geographical kind of framework from a more kind of, I would say, relational approach. That's to say, I can hardly approach the urban without, for example, in this case, there's something that about thinking about the urban as insular, as dualistic to say the rural or the peri-urban. To me, it has an inbuilt kind of coloniality of analytics behind it that makes it invisible, the actual historical spatial history of the relationship between plantation and the development of cities, particularly everywhere, but certainly in Latin America. So like the exodus of self-emancipated Black peoples onto what was becoming kind of an urban spaces and occupying favelas for its kind of a spatial strategic advantage of being up hills for self-defense. That's kind of the spatial history of favelas to this day. So like when I talk about urban feminist Black maroonage in the city of Rio, that's what I'm trying to reveal in a way to review kind of the relationality between, this spatial history, that the discourse of like urban, development and the city hides if it's not relational, right? That it hides if it doesn't bring to the fore kind of the plantation logics behind how it's organized to this day in very racialized, very like, you know, violent, just open violence and, you know, intense, kind of, I would say like Gibson, like Ruth Gilmore would say, organized abandonment, you know, and so the community, Black community economies is kind of the fugitive and also a sort of an urban planning that's made very invisible. It has all kinds of components of urban planning, everything from mediating conflict to managing and self-managing kind of scarce resources in collective ways, addressing the conflicts behind, you know, living, existing, and creating place and belonging with limited resources and under intense state violence. So yeah, I guess what I draw from this approach of community economies is very much the types of inventory, you know, inventorying, okay. Oh, sorry, I forgot the reminder. Okay, well, it's about that. I think I've said it. Just kind of preoccupation with racial capitalism or racial capitalocentrism is what I would say.
Thank you so much, Priscilla. I apologize, I forgot to give a 4-minute warning. I was listening intently and enjoying very much what you were saying. And sorry if I didn't mean to cut you off there. I hope, yeah, you can elaborate more in the discussion. Anna, I think you are next. If you want to, you said you would have something.
Yeah, I thought Marcus was going to talk as well. I can go, but just.
Yes, sure. Marcus, I think, said in the chat that he would be, he was in listening mode for now. Yeah, but if that changes, Marcus, you let us know and come in. Yeah.
Okay, so can you see my screen? Yeah, actually, this is a presentation that I prepared early this year for something else, but since I thought it would be relevant for our discussion, I am going to show a couple of the slides on the screen about that presentation. I'm not going to give it all because of time, but some of the issues that we spoke about in this conversation are relevant to this work, so I thought I could bring it in. This work is related to who has the right to decide about what life counts for or is about in different parts of the city of Buenos Aires. And here you can see a map. To the left, you can see Argentina, it's the South Cone, and the city of Buenos Aires is on the coast of El Rio de la Plata. To the right, you can see the city of Buenos Aires, and there's an arrow showing the Comuna 13, which is where I live and work part of my time, although I live and work also in a different town, which is very close to Buenos Aires, which is where I teach at the university. I can explain that later, but for the purpose of time, I'm kind of running on this. But this is the question about how do we want to live in our city is a question that has been asked over and over, I guess, since early 19th century, actually, that is recorded of. But anyhow, it's been a question that it's been asked for the last 20 years because of the kind of administration we've been having in the city that is pushing again and again to privatize public entire public sectors of the city on the one hand, and on the other hand is providing support for capitalocentric and racist policies and politics of city gentrification. So that's the kind of context in which we are embedded. And what I'm showing is, can you see the whole screen? Maybe not, right? See if I can.
Yeah, we can see
here. So what I'm trying to show here is a timeline that I put together to show that since the beginning of the year 2000, at least in the city of Buenos Aires, there was a big push to put this question that I asked before up front about the ways in which we want to live, and taking up what Nate was saying, is it the only path to move upward? And that sort of myth of being better because you own more and you go up on the ladder of meritocracy, or are there other ways of living, and how, and who's organizing these other ways? And what happened in Argentina in the year 2000, there was a big crisis that I think you are all aware of. And in that crisis, part of what was put forward was making visible these other ways of self-organizing and responding to the question of how we want to live by saying we want to take and make decisions. So what you can see on the screen is what happened at the country level, but also in Comuna 13, which is part of a governmental change that took place in the city, which is that the city started to be governed by comunas. And so as of the year 2006, supposedly each of the comunas in the city have our own council, and we can all as city members participate in decision making. Now, that's what the Constitution of Buenos Aires says and the policy says, but actually what happens in real life is not exactly so. So what's been happening is that all the movement of self-organizing parallel to and within this kind of constitution of the city kept on moving, and very many different self-organized groups took charge of, for example, making decisions about public schools, about cultural and recreational and educational spaces in the city, and of making decisions about public land, for having that land not be sold to investment, but to be shared as a comunidad. So here what I'm putting on the screen is a collage I made in thinking through the concepts of communities and community economies. And I resonate with what Priscilla was saying in regards to the language of community economies being a language that it can be easily appropriated by different people in different ways. And I think that's partly of what's nice about the approach, and also what's very deep about the approach, in that the community concept can be opened up, and in the methodological tool of starting by the inventory, one can start to map out what is out there and what can be there in the future. I think I'm going to be ending on this note because I have a couple more things to talk about. But my last note is that I think that what's useful about the language and the concepts and the methodology of community economies is that it provides a language that is easy to appropriate and to relate to other frameworks. I also resonate with Priscilla's call on educación popular. In my case is educación popular, but also autogestión pedagógica and other concepts that can be looked at from the perspective of community economies. And I'll be glad to discuss this further, but I think I'm right on time, no? Sí? Perfecto, muy bien.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, right on time. Thank you so much. And that's really helpful to share that on the spur of the moment. So thank you for doing that. Marcus, would you like to come in, or you're going to wait? I think I'm going to assume you're going to wait, but if you want to come in, here he comes. Let's see.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't prepare anything, so I just talk right ahead and let's see where it will go. I apologize, it's a bit weird or anything else. So my departing point was basically also like in my project, we have this analysis of global value chains or global production networks. I'm not sure to what extent you're familiar with this concept, but the kind of idea was that, you know, places are interrelated with each other in these perspectives. And let's say these traditional world systems inspired theories are, I think, in diverse economies terms, very strong theories, because they usually say that there is a surplus value transfer from the core and the tourist to the core. That's, I think, what world systems theory or analysis is all about. And probably is everything it has to say on the so-called periphery. So in our project, I said we focus on South Caucasus and Central Asia, which in world systems analysis people probably most likely this periphery to the place where only exploitation occurs. So in I was just wondering that at one point, okay, can you still hear me? Or is it?
Yeah, we can
okay.
hear, but it's sort of breaking in and out. So I just wonder if turning the camera off will help a bit, that we can hear you better, even though.
Okay.
Let's
so
try.
I hope you understand this. So this global production network and this world city, world systems analysis literature, to me only showed that, let's say, the periphery is the mythical place of exploitation in an interconnected world. And I was just wondering for, let's say, also more inhabitable metaphors we could find for these places. So it's just, I start here with engaging with Robinson's ordinary city literature, which precisely departs from world city literature insofar as it says we should also not exclude all these cities that are not the command and control centers of the global economy. And she actually also employs this diverse economies perspective on cities, which I found interesting. But other than this is, let's say, my engagement with urbanism so far. So I'm more or less what I am currently at is struggling with how to conceptualize even the places I'm looking at, because world systems analysis offers me a very powerful perspective, but a too strong theoretical perspective probably on what occurs in so-called peripheries. So I think it's also not so much concerned about urbanism per se, but rather to understand the dynamics of the economy that are related with formations of cities, let's say it like this. But I will close it here.
Thank you, Marcus. That's really helpful to hear where you're at. And I think, you know, that just those links you're starting to make there with global and world cities and diverse economies, that definitely resonates with some of my own thoughts, and I'm sure of others. So we can come back to that. So I'll just do my brief input, and then we can move on to any direct, you know, if anybody wants to make a 5-minute response, you know, but then we can also have discussion. So perhaps I could just ask Christian to drop me a note in the chat if after 4 minutes. So I'd appreciate that. Thank you. I haven't got a timer set up. Thank you. So I guess my kind of engagement with Gibson Graham and my kind of struggle and wish to connect that with urban studies goes back to my PhD, which I began, or even before, in fact, maybe my master's in 2010 or so. But for my PhD, so I came to urban studies without a kind of linear academic background, and urban studies was nice because it was open to someone like me that didn't come through a conventional route. So it would accept me into a master's program, even though I had a different background, and accept me into a PhD. So that's quite nice maybe about urban studies, that it is a more open field perhaps. And it's also quite practice oriented, and it's quite engaged with contemporary policy challenges and you know, lots of work in collaboration. So I found myself enjoying then this entry into this quite particular urban research sort of setting. My PhD, I began with a desire to think about, well, what could all these sort of grassroots, bottom-up, alternative economic experiments, what could they mean for urban policy at the city scale or the neighborhood scale? And I was focusing on London, where I had some involvement and where I was living and working or studying. But on starting with the literature review and all this of the PhD process, the things that you read about London within urban studies tell the story of the global city that Marcus just referred to. I found that didn't at all relate actually to the kind of everyday economies, the everyday diverse economies of the London that I knew, and the ways in which some of the community groups I was forming relations with and involved in, the ways in which they were trying to challenge that global city idea and direction with some propositions of their own around, we want to keep these high streets, we want to keep these small businesses, we want to keep this industrial space, this serves our needs, our communities, and we want a place in the global city. So I really found little to engage with around sort of that lively terrain of contestation around London's economy that I was engaged with, but that I didn't find reflected in the academic writing. And that's when then, Gibson Graham was something I found and really held on to, I think, very tightly indeed, in ways that I have yet to fully develop, I would say. But, as well as Gibson Graham's work that was so creative in opening up and challenging those rigid economic framings, in urban studies, as many have alluded to, there was some quite generative rethinking of urban theory and urban economic development from Jenny Robinson, who happened to be my PhD supervisor. So of course I read The Ordinary City, but also thinking about informal economies and all the work from the Global South that is very much engaging with the informal city and the complexity of urban economies. So that was also generative, and I was interested in trying to bring these things together, but as I say, in ways that I have yet to realize, I would say. So I guess what I wanted to share was some of the ways in which I have been or was then thinking about how diverse and community economies might be used to kind of rethink urban theory, research, action and practice, all of these big things. It's something I want to work on much more, so it's nice to talk through with you. But so one is, of course, the diverse economies sort of sensibility of reading for difference and coming with an open stance and not just immediately finding what you already thought you knew. So that's very important in a city like London or in perhaps over-researched places where we have strong narratives of what they are that constrain possibilities. The second thing then, I mean, of course, the second thing, well, the way in which I ended up beginning this work was with the politics of language, subject and collective action. So I really found this tripartite economic politics very powerful. So the groups that I was working with were facing displacement, and they were kind of challenging that displacement, but they were not residents, they were small businesses, market traders, industrial firms and things like this. But they were forming alliances with local residents groups and other supporters and allies and things. So I tried to think, well, what could, because I was doing collaborative and activist research, thank you, Christian, how could I use and rework this economic politics of language as subject and collective action for this collaborative research? And I found in the end it worked well. I mean, I was doing what I was doing, but this framework helped me to make sense of it, because these groups were challenging economic narratives which really didn't recognize their existence, let alone their value. And they were saying, hey, we're here. These are the communities that we serve, these are the communities, this is the value that we produce, this is our place in the city. But they were also building kind of relations of solidarity and finding common ground. And so to me, that their work to make connections between different economic actors and find solidarity and a basis for working together was connected with the politics of the subject. albeit in a complex urban setting, which was quite difficult to make sense of. And then around action, thinking about the different ways in which researchers could support and nurture and collaborate with groups that were progressing their own community plans or challenging development proposals that threatened to displace them. So I was rethinking that politics of collective action in ways which could perhaps rethink the role of urban theory and research and put that work and resources of the university to the good of the collaborators. So that's kind of where I'm at with this now. And I have to say, to be honest, a lot of my time at the moment is taken up in actually trying to realize a community plan for a threatened market that we finally might actually have the chance to deliver, and to have some space to think through some of these issues is important, because I think for me, the question of what is the potential of the academic research in urban studies to contribute to the flourishing of diverse economies, diverse and community economies, is the key question, because and it's connected to questions about where do we find our place, in academia or somewhere else or somewhere between. So I know everybody is involved in different projects and initiatives, and that is always a challenge for me, to balance these roles and to find the productive and the generative in both sets of work and thinking. So that's what's all I could prepare for now, but I want to open up for Pete. Do you want to perhaps take over a bit the facilitating for any responses?
Absolutely. Thanks, Mfanwe. That was an excellent set of discussions. I thought it was interesting that some were more conceptual, some were more place-based, and that enabled us to, I like the phrase riff across. I've got a colleague, Levi Garman, that uses that phrase a lot, and I think that works good. So yeah, let's sort of riff back really. Was there anything anybody wanted to respond back across all the different presentations and thoughts and comments that people had? We'll sort of take it the way people want to go. Who'd like to go first? I've got a couple of things to say, but I will exercise chair's prerogative and not go first. Nate, I wondered if you found any inspiration for your late capitalist melancholia that I share from the vibrancy of people kicking ass in London and in the favelas and in Argentina. So don't feel like that in Liverpool, I tell you.
Well, yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, I go back and forth all the time. I think, I mean, I was just realizing as I was listening to you all talk that, oh, did I don't know why, I don't know how I got a thumbs up. Sorry, hopefully it'll go away. If not, I'll figure it out. Oh, I think it's because of this. It did it automatically. Yeah, anyway. No, all I was going to say was that I think as people were talking, I was thinking about how, well, really, I was just reflecting on my own slipping back into that left melancholy. And I think that one of the reasons is because, you know, one of the things that I loved initially, still love about the community economies perspective is how, you know, how it encourages us to reframe all the time and to think about framing all the time. And I find that so powerful. And at the same time, I find it really important not to let the reframing take our eyes off of the thing that we need to reframe away from. You know what I'm saying? You know, I mean, thinking about, you know, what Anna and Priscilla were talking about, especially in terms of, you know, racial urbanism. You know, I think it would be a real mistake to sort of take our eyes off the obviously very real racial inequalities in all of these places that we see, right? And I don't think that's what community economies work is suggesting. I mean, I don't think it's saying like, oh, let's just pretend like it's not there. obviously that's sort of one of the critiques that has been responded to, you know, for decades. But I guess I was just reflecting on how hard it is to kind of not slip back in, right? To not just see the kind of oppression everywhere, to not just see, you know, the power of capitalist firms to appropriate digital technologies, right? Like the early internet was this sort of liberatory place where everybody was really excited to do their own thing. I mean, it was kind of a community economy all over the place, right? I mean, and it didn't take very long for the Googles to emerge and do something else with it. And while I think we can recognize that that's true, we can also imagine a different world. We can, you know, notice that that's not all encompassing, that there's something else going on. And I guess ultimately, well, anyway, I guess all I'm really saying is that I've just been reflecting, listening to all of you about how it's sort of like an ongoing, lifelong exercise to try not to slip back in, right? To kind of maintain this. Yeah, that's what I have to say, I guess, initially.
Can I chime in on his comment? Yeah, gracias. You know how Argentinians push anyhow. You know, it's like I ask, can I talk? Yes, I'm talking the minute after. Anyhow, I wanted to bring to our collective memory that you, Nate, wrote a chapter in the handbook on some of these issues. And I think it'd be nice if you can do you want to summarize some of the concerns you had at that point? Because I think, no, okay. I thought.
Give me a minute and I would be happy to do that.
Okay,
to collect my thoughts, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll take chair's privilege here. And one thing that I noticed when I was in Argentina and I went to some of the neighborhood assemblies in San Telmo, Plaza de Rego, and went to some of the recovered factories and went to some of the barter networks, was the incredible sophistication and sort of learnt practices that I noticed amongst Argentines about how to, you know, work in this sort of self-managed way that I can imagine you would get in some of the favelas in Brazil as well. And I contrast that with where I am in Liverpool, where there is such a legacy of social democracy and such a legacy of neoliberalism, where the whole pressure on urbanization is to get people into paid work and get people into jobs and to get businesses in and to grow the economy. To such an extent that people really do struggle to see alternatives at sort of a city manager level. They're really sucked in neoliberalism to such an extent, which doesn't mean that there aren't people in, you know, communities doing alternatives. In London, I was involved in the battle over the Elephant and Castle shopping centre 20 years ago. And we've got plenty of spaces in Liverpool, like Liverpool 8, where there's a very, very long established Black community. It's a Black space in Liverpool, where, you know, all sorts of solidarity economy things are going on, but they're not really called that. There people do like the idea of the community economy more, because they like the way that, you know, we are the community, we are from here, this is part of our place. So I certainly, you know, find that the community economy language really works. But when I've presented this stuff in Liverpool, it's kind of been seen by people I've spoken to as a bit old hat, that this was done in Liverpool, you know, community economies ideas, particularly around ABCD, asset-based community development, mapping, the inventories, working in communities, was seen as something done in the bad old Liverpool, where the place was stuffed. You know, Britain had joined the European Union. We were no longer making money out of, you know, slavery and, you know, buying and selling racialized bodies. That was not what the city was doing now, and it was really, really struggling to find a place. And now it's reinvented itself as part of the sort of the global visitor economy and the hospitality economy and the education economy. And there's work back here again that people tend to see what we're doing as something that is perhaps triage. It's something you do in places that are really struggling, but it's not seen as serious. Yeah, I found people in business, particularly when you think about platform economies, digital, hospitality, food, really buying into the idea that being in business doesn't mean being a capitalist business trying to make as much profit as you can, and lots of cooperative models going on over there. So I'm sort of finding in Liverpool, when we talk about alternative spaces and resistant spaces and everything like that, people say that doesn't work for us. But if you're talking about a cooperative that's, you know, running a digital business or a new economy business, people have really bought into that. So perhaps I'm closer to where you are, Nate, where you're talking about the way that people have taken on the idea of entrepreneurialism and business. But perhaps, you know, we should be thinking of diverse economist perspectives on what it means to be in business and to create wealth, and sort of actually see, painful though it is for socialists to say it, it might be in the private sector where this is happening, rather than sort of the state-centred poverty industry that we've had in Liverpool in absolute trenches, and folk here roll their eyes about this, because what you've got to do is get the poor people into jobs in business, even if that just means setting up an Amazon box in the city. So perhaps do we need to think about sort of more diverse conceptions of urban entrepreneurialism, and not give that to the David Harveys of this world? Is that, you know, something we can be thinking of? Okay, so who'd like to come in next? Yeah, Alison? Yeah,
I've been listening. I actually don't work in an urban environment, and so a lot of this stuff is new. I've been working with indigenous communities in the rural area here in southern Chile since 2013, as I mentioned in my intro. And you know, as a team, we've been immersed in the rural area for a long time. That's where we co-design this asset management tool that takes monetary assets and non-monetary assets and gives opportunities for families to take loans and reinvest in initiatives that they themselves would like to control and manage. And this has expanded to environmental resources and revitalization of cultural patrimony, etc. But a couple of years ago, we realized that we were kind of isolated and stuck in this realm that was that did not take into account the realities of some of these livelihoods, which required markets in order for families to gain some form of steady economic income, so at least they could plan ahead. Because a lot of these, in this context, a lot of the families are constantly reacting to the hardships of globalization and the dissolving of their indigenous cultures. So at some point we wanted to connect to urban settings. So we started this kind of CSA in Santiago, which is the capital, but that took a lot of effort and a lot of time, and it quickly burned out. But last couple of years, my partner and I made the personal decision to move to a tourist kind of hub in a place that connects Mapuche communities to tourism as much as they're able to. That's a whole other discussion. But what we came to realize is that to generate incentives from, say, connecting livelihoods with a market economy, and I think that in itself has a formula. Like, we're identifying that certain assets that are local can be regenerative within the communities, but when they connect with market economies, there are certain products that are value added and that are almost the excess, basically, like how indigenous communities cultivate and harvest plants. Sometimes the excess is used to exchange and to create community trades in anyways. Yeah, so we wanted to kind of apply that same model with value added products that come from these regenerative economies linked to the environment. So we moved to this place where we're at right now. And then all of the social upheaval and the pandemic, kind of put things at a very, a very slow movement. But basically the idea of connecting these worlds, not only rural and urban, but also within communities, because we're also in the Mapuche territory and we're slowly starting to develop relationships with them. So one thing that emerged in some of these observations was in my personal kind of interest is the world of aesthetics, because we chose a place that was seen as promising in terms of urban aesthetics. So I wonder to what extent, for example, could aesthetics play in some of these conversations regarding revitalizing local communities and generating a new role that is not seen as capitalist oriented, but maybe the excess is reinvested back into the community through an aesthetic, perspective. Anyway, so I'm just kind of throwing it out there. I don't study urban studies. I haven't. I did a master's in ethics, peace, and global affairs, which was a combination of international studies and philosophy and religion. So this is kind of all new to me. But I grew up in cities and I love cities. So it's just interesting for me to kind of merge my work experience with also some of the conversations that I'm hearing today. Thank you.
I think there's a big, I think there's a big debate about the importance of connecting communities up through different sorts of markets. Particularly in Liverpool, people would say there's no way you look at a district that's struggling and not see it as part of connected to the wider city and look to build those sort of connections and get the resources flowing around. Yeah. Okay. Who'd like to go? Who'd like to go next? I appeared just then to speak to my daughter, but she's okay now. So who'd like to come in?
I can see Priscilla's got her hand up.
Yeah, go for it, Priscilla.
Yeah, just I think what Alison just said reminded me of this sort of cartoon clip on paradigms of education. I don't know if you've seen it. Sorry, Robin. I can post here in a minute, but it's talking about paradigms of education and sort of how the industrialization of paradigms of education has smashed divergent thinking. Overall, that's what it is. And so part of that kind of confinement or kind of destruction of divergent thinking capabilities is what he talks about as kind of like learning is a process wherein we learn the best when we can envision, therefore imagine the best, wherein we are most present. And so when we are most present, that means our emotions are most present. That's an aesthetic experience. And so in the cartoon, he talks about the paradigm of education of modern industrial life that we know of is unaesthetic. And then it shows like a teacher with like an anesthesia on the student, and the student is like, there's just no feelings, there's no presence, and it's unaesthetic, right? Not aesthetic. And so it kind of, since we're talking about having to reimagine the lenses through which we look at what's present and what exists, we also talk about the kaleidoscope of the future. And you can see that, envision that. If it's aesthetic, meaning if it's present, it's alive, there's feeling, there's emotion, which not much of that I find is the driving motive of urbanization as we know it to be, like, you know, mainly. So I think all of the experiences that kind of emerge from that kind of affective experience is productive for reimagining place, belonging, vision in a static way. Like,
okay, great. Anna, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I wanted to comment on two things. One is that I put in the chat a link to a piece that if this group assembles again, I would vote to read together, because I think it would help see several of the themes we've been talking about from this light. I'm not going to talk about the piece now because I don't think there's time to do that now. But I wanted to connect what Alison and Priscilla were saying, because part of the work we did at this self-organized group at the neighborhood to regain public territory is to imagine what we would like the territory to look like and be like and smell like. And we did a trial with a different space that we won a couple of years ago, which was a much more smaller space than the one that it is being challenged now. And to do that, part of what we did was to connect ourselves with what the space could look like if we thought about it in terms of plants and animals. And so this is a space, I don't have the pictures now, but I can send them to you via email because it's lovely. So what happened, this took like 10 years to happen, mind you, but it did happen. And what happens is that this is a space that it's a square, that it's 100 meter by 400 meters square. And it's now full of plants and small spaces for people to gather. And the plants that were planted there were found by very many of us doing research on what kinds of plants were native of that part of the city at other points in time, or plants that would grow well in that space. So all that was very meaningful in terms of connecting with imagining what we wanted the space to look like, putting ourselves to action into doing something we would cherish and like and cultivate and take care of in common. And related to what Peter was saying about some of the words we use or of the language or the perspective being old, if I got it right. It's interesting to me because one may think that, on the other hand, when you actually do the work, for example, of the inventory or the work of using the iceberg to work with whatever you cannot see and then it becomes visible and so on and so forth, I think it's in the doing of those actions that are methodological and conceptual and epistemological actions that there's no room for whether or not this approach is old or new. So I was thinking through that. At least that has been my experience, both as an activist. I think I said in another session of Liviana, I think a couple of days ago, that I was born an activist. And hopefully I will die an activist. So, right. So, you know, you have to be patient, I think. I say this to myself.
Yeah. Okay. Priscilla, is that legacy hand up, or did you want to come back? Yeah. And Anna, if you want to take your hand down, if you've said what you need to hand. Yeah. I mean, a couple of things we haven't discussed that much yet is sort of the non-human in cities, you know, plants and animals, also infrastructures. We heard a little bit about that from Christian, and we haven't discussed a lot about sort of arts and cultural production as ways of reimagining cities and thinking about cities, and Liverpool has just got shed loads of that. And that works pretty well because, you know, people can, you know, see the jobs in that. And, you know, we talked about using the master's tools against him, usually is a man, but also, you know, thinking about different forms of calculation. But in Liverpool, that works pretty well. And reimagining some of these ideas. Yeah, I hear what you say about the iceberg as being new and thinking about these ideas in different ways. In Liverpool and in Britain, we got this new idea of the foundational economy, where people are talking about ways that, you know, we are thinking about everyday life, infrastructures, how people support each other, mutual aids, connection, the resources we get for free. That is really, you know, taking off. Vanwy, I've just noticed it's 5:30. Do we want to hand back to you for talking about next steps, or do you want to keep the conversation going a little bit longer?
I think let's do both in a way. I just put a garbled set of messages in the chat. Sorry about that. I was trying to post a link to the program session for this, which just contains, you know, the main themes and issues and some of the ideas that came out of the last session. So I just wanted to put that in the chat in case it's helpful to look at what came out of the last conversation and maybe what more we've gathered so far. So I think we should continue a bit, but perhaps start to think about, are there themes that we want to add, or areas that perhaps we feel we're focusing in on, or things that are wrong, or whatever. And then, but I would say come back to the kind of next steps maybe in another 15 minutes or so, Pete. So if you're content to keep going, facilitating for another 15 minutes, then perhaps we could come back. I'll take over for the next steps at the last bit.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Yeah. Who'd like to come in next?
I can riff a little bit.
Yeah.
I think this this piece about the commons is kind of an interesting thing to potentially think with. And I'll just say, I just had a piece that I co-wrote with Amanda Huron. If people know her work, she did one of the Community Economies book series about housing cooperatives in DC. And our argument was sort of about the mixed potential of commons, and kind of trying to think about how commons can be liberatory, but can also potentially become exclusionary, or become a part of the apparatus through which sort of domination works. And so just to kind of think with what some other folks are saying here, and kind of in conversation with, I feel like some of what Nate is saying about the difficulty of trying to apply community economies kind of thinking to situations where there's clearly like capitalist dominance going on. Part of the question I feel like is like, there are all these energies that people have. There's aesthetic sensibilities and affects, there's desire, there's the need for livelihoods. And so, you know, one interesting thing that I keep hearing is like, people are talking about what I hear is like forms of lively activity and surplus that could produce, you know, different kinds of alternative futures, but that also there are very good technologies and apparatuses for capturing and harnessing into dominant structures, whether that be dominant structures of capitalist value extraction, dominant structures of sort of racialized narratives. So I feel like part of the challenge is, I don't know, I wrote a book in the Community Economy series too. And when I gave my proposal to the editors originally, they said, okay, this is great, but you've got this very realist thing going on where you're trying to say, this is what's happening, and use community economies to sort of confirm some external reality, which is fine. But we're also interested in you using this to reimagine stories and reframe forms of creative activity and surplus and value in ways that might not yet be totally real, or to crack open those categories. So I feel like part of the challenge is, how could we talk about these formations of dominance, recognizing them for what they are, but changing the narrative and the kind of way that we think about them to say they're actually made up of all these other kinds of diverse activities that may or may not get captured or enclosed in different kinds of ways. And sort of thinking about like, it's not like these community spaces are free from some of the tensions around things like race, capture, enclosure. So it's like this sort of constant need to be thinking about that back and forth, and in the theorizing then kind of be able to name and look at how that tension actually happens. I don't know, I'm just hearing that across what people are saying, sort of surplus, aesthetics, all these different spaces where these things are happening, and trying to think about ways to theorize and grapple with it and soothe our left melancholy. I don't know, those are just some of what I was thinking.
Yeah, no, I think conversations about what a surplus means and what the commons means and what common means, and just refusing to take a capitalocentric version of the entrepreneurial thesis and saying cities can be creating value in all sorts of ways that are good livelihoods coming out of them. And people get that, particularly in cities where they weren't doing well in sort of capitalist metrics, and now they are, but through different sorts of cultural production. Mafanwi, could you take over for a second, because my kids have just turned up and I need to just let her in. I'll be back in a second. Kids, you'd have them.
Sure, no problem, Pete. I've just been, I mean, my brain at the moment, I have to say, is quite sluggish. But I'm looking back at the themes from last time, and I guess what I feel is that when we're thinking about cities or the urban, we're up against a lot of power and a lot of, the education system is creating urban professionals in a certain sort of way of thinking and acting and doing with a certain imagination, and then we've got urban theory and the way that's producing urban professionals and all the rest. And I guess as perhaps critical urbanists or people engaged with trying to think and progress cities in different ways, or urban life and possibilities in different ways, it's very difficult to move wholly away from that critique, that need to challenge the current system. And I think, one of the difficulties I've had in kind of, let's say, locating myself in diverse and community economies is that a lot of my work and my engagement has come out of very antagonistic struggles, has come out of struggles. And, of course, struggle is at the, you don't just produce an alternative out of nothing. It's a struggle, even if there's no opposition, as it were, you still have to amount all sorts of things. But, in highly pressurized, high value cities, there are quite extreme pressures to kind of be engaged with, but that they can be quite productive of alternatives as well. So I think that challenge to kind of think with and within those settings, but also beyond them, is perhaps particular. Maybe, I don't know, or the pressures or the challenges in doing that sort of work in urban settings, pressurized urban settings, may be different. But also around who, I mean, it came up earlier, that a number of the groups that people have been involved with have not perhaps necessarily seen themselves as commoners or as social entrepreneurs or social activists or solidarity economy practitioners or whatever. And I guess, that chimes with my experiences and thinking through who are the groups, the people, and as Pete has been pushing us to think, do they include the kind of mainstream business actors as well? Like, a lot of my work has been with small businesses that face a lot of that are facing dispossession, and often migrants or BME entrepreneurs and retailers that are being systematically excluded from the city. So, from my trying to do kind of diverse and community economies work in London, it's very hard to get your work to kind of fit with the kind of sensibilities and the desires of communities, diverse and community economies research, because of some of those challenges. So, like I say, I'm not very articulate on these issues right now, but I would really welcome to think through some of those things with others, or hear if anybody else has had those experiences.
I think there's definitely something about urban antagonisms. Am I on the? Yeah, I think there's certainly something about urban antagonisms and different sorts of gentrification. But more cultural forms of gentrification. Is gentrification even the right kind of word, where there's new interesting stuff starting to happen in places? And particularly thinking about the Elephant and Castle, I mean, all the Latin American small businesses formed by migrant groups in this shopping centre in inner city London, creating an incredibly vibrant cultural production and livelihoods and work going on over there, that the standard entrepreneurial thesis didn't value whatsoever. And sort of taking that on by saying gentrification bad didn't work quite so well as taking on these cities of diverse places where there's interesting things going on, and this includes migrant communities. You can get fantastic empanadas. Didn't even know what an empanada was until I went to Argentina, and now I can get an empanada. I can get a mate bowl there. That all that kind of production. And is that
empanada de carne picante? That's the best one.
It is, absolutely. I mean, is that icky form of gentrification where we are telling ourselves nice stories about interesting cultural production while not noticing the great clanking gears of capital that are wiping these things out? I don't think so. When I sort of hear just these blatant navigations for blatant critiques of capitalism and gentrification, I'll say that's not what I see. And that kind of language totally works in Liverpool, and I think there's a lot more we can do about that. Mavanri, I'm not sure if you've seen the paper that me and Matt Thompson and Alan Southern wrote in Rethinking Marxism about antagonism and diverse economies. So I think there's a few people thinking that way, and I think it is an urban thing, because I think in the countryside you can run away, you can create a space where it is all right to create these to drop out and do the differences, and nobody's going to come for you. There's that famous Jodie Dean thing. Bear Stearns doesn't care if you raise chickens. Well, no, it doesn't. So we can raise chickens in the countryside, but it's a bit harder if you're trying to do that in a place where somebody can make a very profitable car park on your community garden, and that's the that's the battle that you get in cities that you don't get in other spaces. I think that's
actually I would challenge that.
Yeah.
Yes, that at least that's not true for Argentina. We do work with communities in rural areas, self-managed public schools in rural areas, and their experience in the last 25 years has been of what Ian Angus has called continuing dispossession. The push, they do mind whether or not they raise chickens, taking up that image. So
So more evidence that we shouldn't shy away from contestation and antagonism, because it's real. Although sort of in a nice privileged place like Totnes in South Devon, where the transition town communities got started, I don't think it's quite an issue. Okay, Mavanwi, should I hand back to you for the last 10 minutes and 10-15 minutes, and we
sure. Thanks, Pete. Thanks, everyone. So I guess we just wanted to make sure there was space to think about what next. I mean, obviously everybody's in their own place doing their own thing. I mean, we've heard already like some really interesting publications and projects underway or in development or out there even, and thank you for sharing all the links. I mean, there's things about maybe, do people want to, is there a need or a wish or a usefulness in continuing more collective conversations around this topic? And if so, in what form? I mean, there's, maybe if people are involved in thinking about future conferences or events, you know, could this fit? Would that be useful? Or are there, you know, collective writing projects or collections that, you know, a way? I mean, I think my reflection on the discussion so far is that, you know, it's complex and we're all kind of grappling and we're all entwined in so many different settings. It is quite hard actually to get out of that nitty-gritty space and to engage with the big questions and challenges around urban theory, which, you know, a number of the contributions really said, you know, there's a problem there and we need to tackle that. But, you know, to me, we seem to actually be getting on with our doing and our projects over here, and we're not quite, or maybe we are, I don't know. Anyway, what do people think? Do we want to meet again or progress together again, or just stay in touch? It's sort of over to anyone who's on this call, to see if you want to get together to do anything more.
I mean, I'll just chime in really quickly and say that, you know, I would love to see some kind, I mean, you know, in the back of my mind, in some folder somewhere on my computer where it has like ideas for papers that someday I'll write, is something about this theme, right? I mean, how do we engage with urban theory from this perspective? For me, a project like that, it would be really important for a project like that to not, I guess just where my interests lie is that I've always envisioned that paper as a paper that speaks to urban theory rather than to CERN or to the Community Economies Collective. You know, because I mean, we know this work, right? Like CERN people know this. Or at least, you know, we're thinking it through and whatever. And, you know, and at the same time, what I don't think would be helpful or well received by people doing urban theory, you know, outside of CERN, would be a paper that sort of says like, hey, urban theorists, you need to be thinking about Gibson and Graham. I mean, I think they should be, right? More than they are. I just don't know that. So my point, I guess, though, is that what I would really like to see is some kind of really, yeah, I don't know, some kind of effort to push the boundaries of that just a bit, to kind of think through these kinds of things. And I guess I'll just say really quickly, you know, Anna, you reminded me, and I didn't say anything about this chapter earlier because honestly, I had to go back and remember what the hell we said in that paper, in that chapter. But just really quickly, Eric Sarmiento and I wrote this chapter for the handbook, and then another paper for Rethinking Marxism that's essentially about genealogy as a kind of, for us, has been a solution to a lot of these problems, and thinking, you know, rather than thinking about capitalist structures as operating because of some kind of structural power, thinking of capitalist structures as things that are remade all the time. And obviously we're inspired by Gibson Graham and the ways that they talk about that reperformance. And, you know, so in some ways that in itself is kind of its own solution. You know, I mean, the points for interception and resistance and whatever are in those moments of reproduction. So anyway, I guess all I'm saying, the reason I mention that now is because this vision that I have for some future project is really informed by that, the desire to think genealogically about the intersection between urban studies and community economies work. So anyway, that's what I have in mind, and I would love to work on a project like that with folks.
Fab. Thank you, Nate. Pete, you're coming in. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's important as well, Nate. You know, as somebody that started out in urban policy, I think when you look at things like, you know, regime theory and people talking about different relationships between policymakers and visions of the cities and the ways these are constructed, I think there's an interesting conversation that could take place between urban studies and diverse economies that isn't Yabu, you're all wrong, we're all right, this is what you should do. But I think there's something that'd be useful to say. And I think, aiming something at the urban studies literature, like there was a good paper just out in Urban Affairs Review just the last couple of days that I thought was a really, really good review of where we are with North American cities and European cities. And if anybody's read that, what I said at the beginning was quite inspired by that paper. I thought there was good stuff in there. So I'd be up for that if that's what people wanted to do. But yeah, no, I'd like to go, write an urban studies paper. Not urban studies, the journal. I don't think that would work quite so well, but something else where people are interested in thinking about cities in more heterodox ways. I think it'd be a good thing to do. I'll be up for it.
Can you post a link to that, or just email the link if you don't have it handy, to that paper?
Don't have it handy, but I will. Yeah, I will. Let me just see while people are talking. Where are we?
Anna, I can see you have your hand up. Go ahead, Anna. Yeah.
En Argentina hay un juego que es el truco. There's a game in Argentina, it's called Truco, which is mostly played with signs with your face. I'll teach you that some other point. But I was thinking on the one hand that since what's the past tense of snuck in. Okay, whatever. Since I wasn't supposed to be here in this talk, but just as a supporter, I don't feel I could say much because also my field is not urban studies for sure. So if people keep on working and would like me to be invited, I'd be glad, but then I guess the agenda has to be in your hands, in other words. I'd be very happy to cooperate and think divergently because it's from a different field that sometimes helps, but I guess the call is on you. We just had a very good experience with Peter and Stephen Healy writing a piece, and even though it was a different piece and everything, I know I can work with him, so that's good. I know I can work with Nate because I already know him and I know that for sure. And so everybody else also, I imagine I can work with. But as I said, in terms of you setting up the agenda, and if you feel that it's important that I can chime in. And then a second note that I have, which has nothing to do with what I said, but came up for me earlier in the talk and I didn't have a chance to say it, but it goes like this. I think that in places such as America Latina, where colonialism is still happening, the scene is quite different from places like the UK. And I think that would be interesting to look into at some point from the perspective of urban studies, of which I know very little. But I think it would be interesting because I think that's something regarding the long-term historical fights and struggles and issues play out very differently, but that's just my take on that. If that were taking upon at some other point for a different paper, not the paper that we're talking about, but another one, then it would be nice to put into dialogue authors that write in different languages, for example, in Espanol and English or in German. Now, Marcus, is your first language sprichst du Deutsch? Yeah, you do. Okay. I can read in Deutsch, some, but yeah, okay. Gracias.
Gracias, Anna, for both the offer to join in the future, as well as a nice specific idea there for developing things. Christian, I can see you have your hand as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to say quickly, like one idea for an intermediate thing. I don't know if people are like me, these are still very much fluid ideas in formation, and I'm not quite to the, I have findings or like a definitive thing I could say about this just yet. I'm on the editorial collective of Acme, which is an open source journal for geographers, but we just did like some revisions of the kinds of things that we publish. And one of the categories that we're going to include now is this category called letters, which is like modeled on like communities of scholars or activists who want to be in conversation. And the format would be like writing letters to each other about things that we are interested in thinking about. So, and then publishing it as like a paper that is a collection of the letters. And it could be like a back and forth. It could be framed as coming from different positions, both sort of literally in space and intellectually. And, you know, there could be some sort of light citation in there, but that might be an intermediate step to help us. If you're like me, that helps work out ideas and get a record. And then you kind of have a little bit of a roadmap of the questions that you want to pose. And I actually think that could be a way to, you know, invite other people into this conversation in a way that wouldn't be like, hey, capitalocentric urbanists, you know, you all need to think something different than what you're thinking, but more like, you know, if we include our trepidations and hand wringing and questions a little bit in those letters, I feel like that could be generative.
That's
I love that idea.
Lovely idea. Yeah, thank you, Christian. The other thing I'm struck by is, you know, we are nervous of kind of upsetting or alienating ourselves from the real urban theorists, and which is, I think, an interesting idea to kind of maybe challenge ourselves a bit about as well, because I think, you know, what's clear is that people are already thinking about urban issues and urban challenges and urban futures from a diverse and community economies perspective. And one of the things I think we could really help one another with is to kind of take the next step and really put that out there, you know, and work with one another to support each other to articulate, well, what could urban studies be like working with these ideas, you know, of course, rather that might not be so alienating, you know, it's kind of like an offering into that space that might not be so kind of challenging. So I'd be interested to see if we can push ourselves maybe to occupy that space as well as invite other people into it. So I think we've got, I'm conscious we're just a few minutes left. We got a very concrete offer from Christian, or a proposition, perhaps. I'm sure you'd need to go back to the journal and everything, but of a letters sort of thing, which could be a very nice way to keep in conversation. And as well, you know, people mentioning, you know, projects and ideas that they have in the back somewhere that they want to bring forward in different ways. And so I think maybe we can progress both. Personally, I'm quite keen to keep some collective discussion because I just find this otherwise quite an alienating space and very difficult to take a step. So I'd be very happy to hold some hands together to take a step, and I think personally it would take me some time actually. So intermediate steps together would be lovely. So what I propose is, I mean, I have been building this email list from the last session last year, as well as a few other people actually that came forward in between times. I think I would propose to add the others to that email list, but maybe that would be then the way to progress this would be, I mean, we could maybe have some side conversations to follow up some ideas and then see who else from that broader group wants to be involved. Does that sound okay? Or what do you think? Yeah, okay, I can see nodding and screens moving, so it must be okay. Okay, in that case, I think we should finish and just say thank you to everybody for all of your contributions and your time, and thank you especially to Christian and Pete for being together in this, and to the CERN team, to Anna and Alison for your support to get this going, and to Kerry, who is not on the call but has been very helpful. So
thanks for inviting it, Mafanwi.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure. I've loved it.
Yeah, this is great.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye everybody. Have a good afternoon or morning or evening. Bye.